On this episode of Physically Spiritual, I speak with Dr. Gerry Crete. We discuss his journey of healing, how he became a Catholic counselor, and how he integrates EMDR with parts work, internal family systems therapy, ego state therapy to heal trauma, and his book, Litanies of the Heart. If you want to support the show, you can become a patron on the Apostle app at physicallyspiritual.com. You can follow me on Substack at becominggift.com, or you can get a copy of Dr. Crete's book with the link in the description. Dr. Gerry Crete, welcome to Physically Spiritual. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I like to start every guest by just asking them how the Lord brought you through your life to the work you do today. Because you're a mental health counselor, you have a great online apostolate at Souls and Hearts, you have this beautiful book integrating internal family systems with the Catholicism called Litanies of the Heart. But what did the Lord do in your life to bring you to that?
I grew up in Canada, and so I've been living in the United States for the last over 20 years now. But I actually experienced a lot of trauma in my early childhood, especially father wound type trauma, an abusive father. And, I kind of developed a lot of my own resilience, focused quite a bit on academics and wanting to, I guess, be successful. I lived in a pretty low socioeconomic kind of family environment, and I wanted to excel. I wanted to, do well. And I went to a very good university in Canada for my undergraduate degree and focused on that, the academics side of it. When I was working as a teacher, eventually we moved to the United States, I worked as a school counselor, and then eventually wanted to do a doctorate in initially counseling, but I was really interested in this area of school counseling at the time, and how counselors in schools can be leaders. And so I was really kind of focused on that, but I kind of took an interesting turn where in my program at the University of Georgia, they really got you to look at your own history and your own life. And I started doing that. And I realized where my passion was that my passion was related to healing and growth around the trauma that I experienced and the childhood abuse that I experienced. And so that really was a shift. And that my major professor, the person who was overseeing your dissertation at the time, she was an expert in trauma. And so I basically started to really explore this area, which led to both a professional but also a personal kind of growth, personal kind of experience, where I was really started to look at how men experience trauma, especially, and how that is somewhat unique, and exploring my own, some of the healing. I'd done some counseling for myself. I had done some counseling before. I had received some assistance and help, and I kind of thought, yeah, I've grown. I've kind of, I've worked on myself. I had a very strong spiritual life, especially in college. I really grew and, came on fire in my faith. Well, it started in high school and then really kind of grew in fruition in college. But it was this sort of turning point where I realized this whole area of trauma, and especially for men who have experienced abuse, was unexplored largely. And I suddenly went into a deep dive, and I completely turned my whole dissertation focus around, where I started doing this. My focus was on interviewing men who had experienced childhood sexual abuse and who had experienced healing in relationships, and so that became my whole focus. And that led me into my own more counseling, more therapy, more spiritual growth for me. It also led into some of the studies and some of the things I wanted to get to know. So I started doing like trauma specializations in counseling, and I learned EMDR. I learned how to do EMDR with people. Eventually I learned about internal family systems and about parts work. And so I started using that as well. And so basically, my passion became working with trauma survivors.
I'm curious what, when you did that kind of dive into specifically men experiencing trauma, like what
Mhm.
were some of the main findings of like how men experience trauma different than women, or what were some of the unique characteristics?
Yeah, yeah, no, because when you do a dissertation work, you're typically looking at the areas that intersect.
Hmm.
And so the area of trauma, right, and the area specifically childhood abuse, and then you're also looking at, you know, therapeutic modalities that are designed to help treat that. But then you're looking at the uniqueness of the male experience. And what I there wasn't a lot there. I ended up doing a certain amount of connection with the American Psychological Association Division 51, which focuses on men. You know, it's a very secular, it's a very, progressive kind of approach. Nevertheless, they were the only group doing work with with men and how men understand their lives. And there's Jim O'Neill out of the University of Connecticut had done all this research on specifically on how men respond to emotions and so on, and respond to different challenges in their lives. And so the unique difference between men and women in this area, because there's a lot of similarity, of course, as human beings, we all respond to trauma in similar ways, but men especially um, restrict their emotionality in response to trauma. So they more than women, they lock down on repressing their own emotions. And because they're extremely uncomfortable, men in general, we're almost trained or socialized early in life to avoid our emotions and to just sort of plow through difficulties because we're expected to be independent. We're expected to just work through it without help. So men are kind of socialized not to ask for help. We're socialized to be independent, do things on our own, repress our emotions, and all these things. And yet all the research in terms of trauma and healing and growth and everything is all about learning how to share your emotions in safe places, and it's about connecting with others and about relationality and about, emotional growth. And yet men are actually socialized to do the opposite. So that became, even in my clinical work, whether I'm working with somebody with a child abuse history or not, I got kind of excited about helping men to become, as I put it, relationally and emotionally competent, because
Yeah,
we're actually not taught to do that.
I've been in and out of counseling in different seasons through pretty much my whole life. Um, I'm amazed even today, you know, I'm not currently in counseling, but was a couple years ago. I remember sitting in that room and just at moments being like, why can't I even be vulnerable here? Like, why can't I just share exactly what I'm feeling? I continued to have this impulse toward self-protection or toward filtering those emotions. And it was a wonderful counselor whom I had worked with for 3 years and trusted deeply and felt very comfortable with. So, uh, so that persistence of that pressure, that kind of gravity toward self-censoring, or it's a really powerful phenomenon I've experienced in my life. I'm just curious about that experience of yours of kind of being maybe an expert or someone who maybe the external world pressures were on you to make you they'd be like, I kind of got this all figured out now, or like, I'm the healer. I'm not the one that needs healing. But what was
Hmm.
that like for you in that moment of realizing that you really needed to kind of do a deeper dive in yourself um, and just be invited into probably a new vulnerability, a new posture in your work?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a great question, and it was a bit of a journey. I mean, I think when it came to doing some individual counseling, and I even participated in some group counseling experiences earlier on that were very helpful. The idea that I would actually self-disclose was a radically difficult one, and it was one that forced me to challenge my own beliefs and my own practices, because I can remember in my cohort, um, in my doctoral cohort, we were doing some work on trauma, like, so we're taking classes on trauma and looking at social justice, and it was a very secular program. But I remember deciding to tell, I was doing I think I had some kind of trauma project or something I was doing, and I was talking about the different influences of different people in my life and everything else. And I just decided to tell my cohort, yeah, I was a survivor. And the fact that that was hard for me to do is really telling. And because I had to go through a little journey of my own to say, why should that be difficult? I didn't do anything wrong. I'm the victim here. I'm the person who survived. Why is it a shame on me to tell my story? And I had to confront that and realize, no, it isn't. And in fact, in telling my story, it's powerful for others at times. As a counselor, I don't usually tell my own story like when I'm working with somebody in therapy, because I feel like the focus needs to be on them. But in general, though, otherwise, I am like, it isn't my shame. It's someone else's shame, honestly. And in being vulnerable and just being honest about it is actually, I think, breaking that cycle for men to be ashamed of their own pain and ashamed of their oun ways in which they've been hurt, and the way, and so, it's a powerful thing. Like for me, I remember in the 1990s, growing up in Canada, there was hockey, right? I used to play hockey, like I now live in Georgia where football is the main thing, right? But in Canada, it's hockey is the same idea. Like the most manly thing you can be is a hockey player. And so when I remember sometime in the mid 90s when Sheldon Kennedy, who was the time he was playing for Buffalo, came forward with the fact that he had been abused by his coach, was huge. It's like, whoa, here's a hockey player coming forward and being vulnerable with his own hurt, his own suffering. It was radical. And then later that inspired Theo Fleury, who played for the Calgary Flames, who played for Team Canada, to come forward with his story of having been abused by the same person that abused Sheldon Kennedy. And so to see these men, masculine men, sharing, being vulnerable and sharing, it was game changing. And I think we don't see that enough. I think there's some celebrities that have come forward, their stories, their history of trauma, and that I think that empowers people, empowers men really to come forward and say, yeah, I've been hurt too. And even if you haven't had that kind of abuse, even if you haven't had that exact kind of trauma, all men have experienced, and all humans have experienced some trauma. And we need to be able to name it and be vulnerable in order to heal. And we need to be able to be honest and work through our issues, and in hiding them and in thinking that we have to be strong and perfect for everybody is what keeps us unhealed.
This concept of trauma, it seems really pervasive in society today, but that doesn't feel familiar to me yet. It's interesting. You had brought up being from Canada. I sometimes I contextualize this with maybe two of the most famous mental health professionals from Canada, Gabor Mate and Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
As kind of two extremes, like Jordan Peterson's like 12 rules for life, like wake up, make your bed, sort of just do it. Maybe like a classic liberal kind of anthropology kind of operating in the background. Maybe that's more exposed now with his higher political involvement. On the other hand, Gabor Mate, kind of a high focus on trauma. And I think a lot of emphasis on environment as being the key.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of kind of Marxist anthropology operating in the background, as his most contemporary book talks about that more. But there seems to be a bit of like a spectrum here between life was hard, but you just got to go out there and do the hard things in spite of it all. And like, that's how you get better. Like, don't spend too much time thinking about the past. And on the other hand, there seems to be an extreme of like, you're wounded by all the stuff that happened to you and you don't really have control over your environment perfectly. So you may or may not be able to find healing. So you have to become more of an activist to try to change the systems that are causing this damage. And so, I mean, I understand that's kind of an extreme framing, but I guess just to your understanding of kind of this concept of trauma, the role it plays in the healing process, and yet maybe the balance with that of needing to just to take personal responsibility and be kind of active in our growth process.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting mentioning those two characters is certainly interesting to me. I would say, just as a comment, and I haven't read Gabor Mate's recent book. I haven't been following him too recently, but I did listen to him a few years ago in a number of different places. One thing I loved about his approach was that he was being vulnerable about his own trauma history.
Yeah.
And I thought that was fantastic. And he was, and I believe, he was describing even the work that he did and how he got to a place of understanding trauma. So, I probably relate a little better to him and to his whole approach. Jordan, I think he's fascinating. I enjoy listening to him as well. I feel like he stays in that intellectual domain. I mean, he shines there. And I think people respond to that. And I think there's this hunger for, for real intellectual rigor and so on. And I would be really curious in his case to understand better his own trauma history. I mean, he did go through, he does describe in a little bit of tiny detail about his own depression and his own struggles, but I don't know that he actually gets to the heart of it. He may personally do that. I have no idea, but not. I haven't heard it in what he has said. He stays intellectual. I would be really interested to know, at a heart level, what is going on there for him.
Yeah,
and of course, like everyone's interested in his faith journey and to what extent he has one. And I think that is a heart question, and he stays in the intellectual domain mostly. So it would be interesting if he was more vulnerable about his heart in areas of faith and in areas of his own personal trauma and history.
I definitely presented caricatures of both of them. I find it interesting intellectually in that I see the roots of their thought are different kind of outgrowths of after kind of post-Christendom, kind of the classical liberal and then the Marxist as a response to that. And then they're grappling with these kind of contemporary topics and then how that then plays out then in their recommendations. I think there's something of a tension between the two. I haven't really got my thoughts really clear on it yet either, but there's something there I want to explore further.
Well, I mean, Gabor, at least, he works with people suffering with trauma directly. And so I think he would understand, and again, I can't speak for him, but I think he would understand even the approach that I would take, which is starting with the body, the physical body, in terms of when you treat people who've experienced trauma. And all human beings have experienced trauma. And so I'm coming at it from understanding how the body responds at a very physical level, right? And how our nervous system works when we're either physically or emotionally or spiritually, for that matter, like threatened.
Yeah.
And I think that so much of the approach of psychology has been to start with either the behavior itself or the thinking around that behavior, but doesn't, until recently, hasn't really started with the physical body and realizing that unless we address that, then we can't change people's thoughts and beliefs and all those things that, cognitive psychology would like to try to address. We can't even get there because we haven't addressed the trauma itself and how it impacts our physical body. And I think Gabor gets that better than Jordan, from what I've observed.
I would agree. And with it too, I think as a Catholic, I think of the value of kind of Aristotelian philosophy, because you had the world of the mind, more of like a Platonic approach, and then there's kind of this contemporary materialism. And oftentimes we can respond to our world's materialism with ideas, but it doesn't really get to the core of what's happening. And I think Aristotle's philosophy really helps to break through that and transcend that dichotomy. But you mentioned they're kind of the body-based approach. And when I first encountered internal family systems or this kind of parts of work approach, I have to admit, I was kind of familiar and had gone through like somatic experiencing, kind of a body-based approach to trauma.
Yeah.
And of course, just kind of familiar with psychology in general. And when I encountered parts work, I kind of thought like, oh, another thing, like, like, do we really need this? This just seemed to be like complicating an issue I already felt like I had a pretty good grasp on. And then over the years, as I've continued to kind of forge that path of just self-understanding, of renegotiating trauma in my life and everything else, I guess, and then reading your book, I've come to appreciate something about parts work in that I feel like it kind of like pulls the mind back in a little bit, which is helpful. As opposed to, just thinking of maybe like doing a traditional like body scan and like sort of going through the body and noticing sensations and feelings. And then with parts work, then actually creating kind of a mental bookmark or a person or an image that then corresponds with that sensation. And it just struck me that it was a very human approach to it, that it kind of brought that body-based psychotherapy and integrated the kind of more cognitive element of man more completely into that work. And so I guess I'm curious of like your own journey of you were, a trauma-informed therapist trained in EMDR. And then you said later you found this internal family systems or parts work system. And was just curious about your own journey of like realizing that adding this element in was really valuable and how you discovered that.
I was first trained in EMDR, and it was a game changer at the time, because it really did help bring everything together in terms of understanding trauma. And the way that I was trained in EMDR was, obviously my trainer had a lot of experience with like the work of Pat Ogden and the whole a body focus. So naturally, I learned right away to kind of attend to the physical body first and to understand that. But EMDR, the basic principle of it is like bilateral stimulation, where you're accessing kind of both sides of the brain. And so you're accessing that right side of the brain, so to speak, which is, unconscious material a lot of the time. This limbic system, you're getting at emotions, you're getting at dreams, you're getting at, material that's suppressed and all that. And so you're accessing that and integrating it with the so-called left side of the brain, which is linear and everything else. And so I was doing this work and it was like amazing, right? And we were able to like work with people and work through and process trauma in a way that talk therapy got to, but it took forever. And this got to it pretty quickly. So I experienced a lot of, in my practice, so much positive change and so many good things. Once I learned about parts work, internal family systems, I was also trained in ego state therapy, even more so. But once I realized that we had these different parts of the system, and one of the brilliant aspects of Dick Schwartz's work in an internal family system is giving these helpful categories to our parts. So he talks about manager parts and firefighter parts and exile parts. And it's just a helpful, useful kind of understanding of how parts sometimes function and how they take on roles. Well, what I started to realize was sometimes when I was doing EMDR and we were doing that deeper work, that I was actually accessing a protector part when I thought I was accessing an exile part. And therapists in general want to go right to the exile. It's our natural tendency. We want to go to the wounded child. We want to go to the exile part, the hurting part. We want to start working there. And of course, so I'm kind of like that too. And so what I realized though was that if I did get there, a lot of the time I was bypassing a protector. EMDR can kind of do that. It can like surprise the system in a way by getting right into the heart of it and bypassing the protectors that are naturally there for some reason. And so what would happen is you would have this amazing session with somebody. You would work with some exile part. Essentially, you work through some kind of major processing of some memory. And as a therapist, I'm like, wow, that was the most amazing experience I've ever had. This person's changed for life, clearly, right? And they feel that way too. But then they come back a week or two later and they're like, relapse in some way. And I was like, oh, why is this person relapsing? Like, we just had this amazing session. And it was only through working with parts and understanding parts that I realized, oh, I went around their protectors and I didn't include their system that was protecting for a reason. And so what will happen there is that your exiles have protectors that are making that are there for a reason. It may seem to us like, oh, that's not good protection. But at one point in their lives, or usually like childhood, we protect by either having like an emotional like block, some kind of wall, or some kind of coping means that protects us from having to be overwhelmed by our own wounded parts, right? Our own feelings of shame and pain and everything else. And so when you suddenly become vulnerable out of nowhere through a process like EMDR, the protective parts freak out because we've just like their whole reason for being, not the reason for being truly, but their sense of the reason for being is compromised. And so then they don't know how to handle that vulnerability. So what parts work does, what internal family systems does, is it helps you to, as a therapist and working with people, it helps you to ally with, get to know, spend time with their managers and their firefighters and their protectors that are there for a reason, and to help those, get them on our side. You want to have the protectors unburden themselves because they may have issues, right, and coping things that they're doing, but you're working with them, you're getting them on your side. They then, those parts of your internal system become resources, right? And you almost get permission with them. And then you work with the wounded child parts. Then when you're welcoming the wounded exiles and whatnot, they're less wounded now, you're working with them, you're bringing healing, you're bringing love, compassion, you're giving them what they always needed, these emotional corrective experiences, and you bring them into the system now with these protector parts that are welcoming them. And so now you're actually creating a system where all the parts are being respected and included, and roles are changing in positive ways. And then the whole system has a greater level of harmony. You're not getting around parts of the system because they're in the way. You're actually including them. And to me, that was a game changer. I hope that all makes sense.
It does. It does. Yeah, let's unpack that. For anyone in the audience, we have past episodes on EMDR, body-based therapy, trauma. So I'll link those in the show notes if you want to dig into some of those bigger concepts. But I would really want to dig into this idea of these parts. What we're talking about here, and you make this clear in your book, is that these parts have a phenomenological existence, right? So they're in our consciousness, they're in our perception. They're not metaphysical. They're not even necessarily grounded in specific parts of the body, although they might be experienced in parts of the body. So these parts, I remember early experiences like in college of going home to my parents' house and just noticing how different I was emotionally and how old habits came back, and just like I felt like I was like time warped back in time. And thinking back now, I think there were probably different set of parts in my personality that became active in that environment. But essentially what we're saying is there's different manifestations of your personality, of emotions, of thoughts, of patterns, of language. And these were forged in your life, in your history, in your story, in different moments where you had to show up in different ways to survive, to be safe, to be adaptive, to be effective. And essentially what happens is our psyche like holds on to these various manifestations of ourself, of thoughts, feelings, words, etc. And then in later moments, in what we're going through things, whether it's something that's familiar or useful, basically our mind says, oh, I know what to do here, right? And these different voices or thoughts or feelings or words or whatever are then in our present and active, right? So within our consciousness, we're experiencing basically we might call them different voices that are kind of weighing in on the conversation. Is that a pretty good description of kind of what these parts are and how they're working? And then would you kind of add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just explained that really well. You explained that beautifully, actually. I would just say, yeah, like when I first discovered parts and was using them and found them to be so amazingly useful and helpful therapeutically, I had this question in my head, like, yeah, but is this real? Like, and is this Catholic? Like, how does this actually work? Right. And, so to some extent, exploring it, even just biologically, in terms of, I'm not a neuropsychologist or a neuroscientist or whatever, but I got curious about like how our brain works. Are we talking about neural pathways here? Are we talking about like, we develop different neural pathways that would include those thoughts and behaviors and perceptions that are just kind of like our brain somehow just kind of like reinforces. So I was curious about that, but I was also curious of spiritually, what does this mean like for the soul? Like, do we have all these different kinds of parts, and what does this mean? And so it took me, this is basically my book. One of the things that I got into was just wanting to understand that. So from a philosophical point of view, I came to the conclusion in so much of what I was reading that from a Thomistic and philosophical point of view, that our parts don't have separate ontological existence. So like, I think you were getting at that when you said they're phenomenological. In other
Yep.
words, we as a human being, we have an ontological existence, but our parts are not separate beings. Right. So, and that's where I really diverge, I think, from Dick Schwartz and some of the things that he says that might imply that. But so they have a phenomenological reality to them. In other words, we experience them. And so what are they? And it really took me to like looking at the Bible. I mean, especially St. Paul, when he talks about an inner conflict, I do what I do not want to do, this kind of thing. So, and then I was looking at different saints, St. Augustine talking about his disintegrated self, and this, the concept you kind of see in so many of the church spiritual, like the mystical elements of the church, of this sort of like, what is it, this unity, right? And what does it mean to be in disunity? What does it mean for our hearts to be fragmented? We see a lot of the language that is used in a lot of the writings of the saints kind of allude to this sort of need for unity, and that our soul and somehow is fractured or whatnot. So I guess it was this whole journey for me to kind of like figure out, okay, what is the church saying about the soul? What is it? And do our parts consistent with the Catholic understanding? And more, I just discovered that they were, and that they maybe weren't using language of 21st century psychology and internal family systems to describe the multiplicity and complexity of the inner workings of the personality. But they essentially were, in different kinds of language, were expressing this inner multiplicity that are, when you explore the inner world, right? And so many of the saints kind of get at that, whether it's St. Teresa's interior castle, or whether it's, St. Maximus talking about the workshop of the soul, or how the kingdom of God, in the sense of the universal kingdom of God that Christ is trying to implement in the universe, is also happening within us. So all of a sudden, this notion of complexity and multiplicity within became more and more obvious to me from a Catholic, a theological perspective.
I agree. And I had to, I think, go on a similar journey of, does this make sense? Are we pulling in things into our Catholic worldview that aren't appropriate, or is this something that can be integrated? So these parts, they need to be identified. They need to be kind of, almost like you need to build a bit of a relationship with them, a bit of familiarity. You mentioned the book, letting them name themselves, maybe even, or using different tools like imagining a living room or a space where they're kind of gathering in order to interact with them. But the one thing that kind of surprised me was you talk about being blended with the parts versus being differentiated. And so my bias coming in, thinking of like concepts of integration, concepts of, the need to be one, to be whole. And with that kind of bias, I came in thinking, wouldn't the goal be to be blended? Right? Don't I want to just be me, just be one? And with that, then the goal would be to take all these parts and sort of obliterate them or mix them together into my inner self. So it was interesting to me, kind of learning this idea of the need of differentiation and how health is actually when the parts remain differentiated, but really that the parts become, I don't know, collaborative or sort of on the same page as the inner self, or working toward the good that you really want. Yeah. So just, would you share some about that idea of differentiation and the value of that versus, my kind of bias coming in was, I want to just be one part.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Yeah. I mean, this whole idea of discovering my and your, all of our inmost self, like that we have an inmost self. And St. Paul uses that language. So that's the language I chose to use. In Dick Schwartz in Internal Family System talks about just the self, tends to capitalize the S because he kind of sees a divinity in it, which I think I don't like the way he frames that fully, but he's onto something in that our inmost self is I believe our core spiritual center and best reflects the image of God in us. And so, and we see that in the history of all the writings of, the great mystical saints. They talk about, sometimes they use language like true self, or they talk about, this inner, this cave of the heart, or this central, like this sort of the central spiritual center. And so we have like the self, but we also have these parts that have kind of a role or have some kind of function and are useful and helpful and resourceful. And so we have our heart, if you will, the way I look at it is our heart includes at its very core this spiritual center, and then different parts that are have functions and roles and stuff like that. And so when those roles or those parts are acting independently because they're disconnected from our spiritual center, from that inmost self, then they're fairly insecure in those situations, but they're very resilient and they're very, resourceful. And so they will do whatever they can to help the whole system, the whole person survive. And so what trauma does often is it disconnects our parts from our spiritual center, from our inmost, our core. And those parts then blend, if you will, or they kind of like take over, if you will. And so our personality shows up to others as that part. So if I have a part of me that's very, task oriented and very organized and likes to, is a hard worker, hey, that's a good part, right? I should have a part that is a hard worker, that is, focused on getting things done and is very helpful. But when that part has learned, I have to do everything on my own, I have to be independent, I can't trust anybody else, I can't rely on anybody else, and my whole identity is around being perfect and good and helpful and resourceful to others, then that part is carrying a burden of, I have to do it independently, I have to be perfect, I can't make mistakes, I have to work hard, right? Like that almost becomes like this burden. And now this part, if it's disconnected from the inmost self, then that's what other people are going to see of me. I'm just this guy that gets things done. I'm a workaholic. I'm just you know what I mean? That's who I am to the world. And that's a blended part. But the truth is that's not who I am. That's a useful part. But if that part needs to be unburdened from all those false beliefs that my whole identity is about what I do, and that part needs to be at the service of my core spiritual center instead. So there, it needs to be unblended in a sense that it is not in the driver's seat, and my core spiritual center, my inmost self, is able to love and nurture and bring the sense of calm and bring the sense of compassion and everything else to this part. And when that happens, then I can be a good worker, but that's not my whole identity, and it is tempered with, like this truer sense of who I am and God's work and grace and love and faith and hope and everything working through me. It changes just the entire way that the person's inner world works, and creates this general sense of like harmony, but inner peace, if you will, and inner calm. And also in a realization that, okay, yeah, I have this worker part of me, but I have other parts of me that are also like interesting and resourceful and helpful and beautiful. And so, like, the beauty is that I'm not one completely, just like one. I am one in a sense, but the beauty is I have all these different aspects of my personality that God created me with, and they're all at my disposal. And when they're connected to that inmost self, you know, then I'm flourishing as a human being, and I'm multifaceted as a human being. And and I am, at peace with that. And then what do people see in me? They're going to see layers, and they're going to see different aspects of me, but all of me is going to be guided by the fact that I'm created in his image, and that I'm a beloved child of God, and that I am, the 8 C's that Dick Schwartz talks about, like calm and creative and compassionate and courageous, and all these different. And I would add to that the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And to be more accurate, I'm kind, and I'm gentle, and I'm, and I have temperance, and I have, the that is the full expression of being a full human being. And I'm not locked into one part that's burdened and is hobbling around coping in some way.
Yeah, I think of like the central problem of philosophy is the one and the many, but then how that's perfectly reconciled in the Trinity, right? And then I think of John Henry Carl Newman when he talks about how then we account for how higher beings are more complex than lower beings in creation. You'd think, we would kind of, get simpler and simpler as things get higher and higher up the ladder of being. And he talks about how God's perfection in creation, but like kind of hits a prism, like it hits a prism, and then, you have this kind of, spreading out of the colors or the different elements. And so how actually as things get higher the ladder of being, they get in a sense more complex, but also more one, more themselves, more of an identity. And so I see this as a kind of a really beautiful, experience of that reality, that within ourselves we're a little church in a sense, a little kingdom of God.
If I can just throw something out, this is something that's
Please.
new for me that I'm exploring right now, that it just hits with what you're saying. I've been deep diving lately into St. Bonaventure after a lot of time in Aquinas and Albert, and they're like fantastic. But I've been deep diving into Bonaventure, and I just feel like my whole life, like I've been missing Bonaventure now. And he does an interesting thing, and he compares the different all, I think it's 9. I want to say 9 classes of angels and the hierarchy of angels, and he describes the hierarchy of the soul, and he relates the hierarchy of the soul to those angels, and that the different angels have different functions in the kingdom of God, I guess, like spiritual functions, but that on some level that those different functions and those different qualities of these different angels are reflected in our human soul. And so I'm excited about exploring this because it just sounds so fascinating to me. And he also describes it almost like a not a one, like the hierarchy isn't just like, oh, you're working your way up this ladder. It is a bit of that, but it's also like the ladder kind of comes and goes, like you go up and down, like Jacob's ladder, like you go up and down. And so you're constant. It's not like just you have to get to the top and you figured it out and your soul is perfect. It's more that all the elements of these different qualities of the soul are going to be constant. You're going to be experiencing them in different ways in different times in your life. And so there's a rhythm to it, which I'm just learning about myself and finding that fascinating. So I love it when I discovered saints I didn't know as well before, and that they have something to add to this whole understanding of our interior world.
Yeah, that's powerful. And the the compatibility or harmony of reality. That I love that when you see like the way that God made the angels has a certain resonance then in how he created the human, right? So there's kind of an internal and external, and then an up and down and a side to side. And there's this way at which creation is symphonic, right? And it's just so beautiful when you see those connections.
Mm-hmm. I love that word, symphonic. Can I use that?
Yeah, please. So with that, I think that's a good place to close it up. I want to point people to everywhere where they can find you. If you want more of Dr. Crete's ponderings and thoughts, you can catch he has a couple blogs, a couple article series at Souls and Hearts. So Souls and Hearts is a beautiful ministry focused on educating people around this idea of integration, around mental health, around the Catholic faith that he co-founded with Dr. Peter Malinowski. You can find his counseling practice at transfigurationcounseling.com. So he's licensed in Georgia. So if you're in Georgia, and I'm sure he's got a wait list, but if you want some one-on-one counseling in some of those modalities, you can look him up. Or on Souls and Hearts, there's actually a directory, I think, of Catholic counselors who integrate internal family systems. You can pick up his book, Litanies of the Heart. So it's a great book published by Sophia Institute Press. Every chapter has like a story or witness about what's being talked about. A section of psychology of the interior world. So kind of digging into some of the science, some of the psychological concepts. And then there's a scripture study section, exercises and reflection questions in each chapter. So it's a great book, very practical, but also very deep, and will introduce you to a lot of concepts around mental health and wellness and emotional health, even but beyond internal family systems. And then if you want to kind of catch another podcast, so there's an Interior Integration for Catholics podcast that Dr. Peter does through Souls and Hearts. So he is frequently exploring these themes of internal family systems and parts of work on that podcast. So anything you want to close with, Dr. Peter or Dr. Crete? Sorry.
Yeah, I would just say too, like Transfiguration Counseling, we do have, I think, 12 therapists and a coach in multiple states. So not just me. We're trying to bring Catholic therapy to the whole nation if we can. We're growing.
Wonderful. Yeah. So don't hesitate to get some help. If any of this is resonating with you, get a copy of the book. And with that, thank you so much for coming on the show, Dr. Crete.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining me on Physically Spiritual. If you want to support the show, you can become a patron on the Apostle app by going to physicallyspiritual.com. You can follow me on Substack at becominggift.com. I've been your host, Andrew Reinhardt. God bless everyone.